The war room at NATO headquarters fell silent as the encrypted transmission crackled through the speakers, revealing that a dismissed intelligence analyst had just prevented nuclear missiles from launching across 3 continents. What they didn't know was that the woman they'd called past her prime had been the only person standing between civilization and World War III. Colonel Margaret Chen stepped out of the military transport at Ramstein Air Base, her weathered combat boots making contact with German concrete for the first time in 15 years. At 54, she moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned that wasted motion could mean wasted lives. The October wind cut across the tarmac, carrying the scent of jet fuel and the distant rumble of cargo planes preparing for missions she was no longer cleared to know about. Her service record spoke of 3 decades in military intelligence, specializing in Eastern European affairs and nuclear threat assessment. 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart from her time in Kosovo, and commendations from operations that remained classified even now. But none of that seemed to matter as she watched younger officers stride past her toward the NATO Strategic Command building, their digital tablets glowing with real-time intelligence feeds she was no longer authorized to access. The retirement ceremony was 3 months ago. A polite affair with standard speeches about distinguished service and well-earned rest. What they hadn't said, but what everyone understood, was that the modern intelligence community had moved beyond the need for old-school analysts who relied on cultural understanding and human intelligence networks. Satellite imagery, electronic surveillance, and algorithmic threat assessment had supposedly replaced the messy business of actually understanding how people think. Margaret's recall to active duty had come through official channels, buried in bureaucratic language that made it sound routine. Temporary assignment as a liaison officer for NATO's Eastern European desk. Translation services and cultural consultation for visiting dignitaries. The kind of assignment designed to make use of her language skills, while keeping her well away from anything that actually mattered. She pulled her single duffel bag from the transport and made her way toward the administrative building. Around her, the base hummed with activity that felt both familiar and foreign. The uniforms had changed, the technology had advanced, but the underlying rhythm of military life remained constant. Personnel moved with purpose. Vehicles carried equipment to destinations known only to those with proper clearances, and beneath it all lay the eternal tension of readiness. Without knowing exactly what they were preparing for, the liaison office was exactly what she had expected. A small room in the basement of Building C, equipped with an outdated computer terminal, a phone that looked older than some of the lieutenants she'd seen on the tarmac, and a single window that offered a view of the parking lot. Her new supervisor, Major David Kane, was 38 years old and looked like he'd stepped out of a recruitment poster. Harvard MBA, 2 combat deployments, and the kind of confident bearing that came from never having experienced real failure. Colonel Chen, Kane said, not quite managing to hide his surprise at her appearance. Welcome back to active duty. I have to say, when I heard they were assigning someone with your experience level to our Cultural Affairs Division, I wasn't quite sure what to expect. Margaret set her bag down carefully and took in the room's sparse furnishings. What exactly are my responsibilities, Major? Kane consulted his tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be a hastily assembled job description. Primarily translation work for visiting Eastern European officials. Some cultural briefings for our younger intelligence officers who might not be familiar with regional customs. General consultation on matters requiring historical perspective. The phrase historical perspective hung in the air like a polite euphemism for outdated knowledge. Margaret had heard similar language before, usually from people who confused institutional memory with institutional deadweight. I see. And what about current threat assessments? My clearance level should still allow me access to. Actually, Kane interrupted, his tone becoming more formal. Your security clearance has been adjusted to match your current assignment. You'll have access to whatever materials are necessary for your specific duties, but the broader intelligence picture isn't really within your purview anymore." Margaret nodded slowly, filing away this information alongside her growing understanding of how she was perceived by the current command structure. She had been brought back not because they needed her expertise, but because someone in Washington had decided that her language skills and cultural knowledge might occasionally prove useful for ceremonial functions. Over the following days, the pattern became clear. Margaret was assigned to translate conversations between NATO officials and visiting diplomats from Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. Simple work that any competent linguist could handle, but which carried the added benefit of keeping her occupied with tasks that felt important without actually being significant. The younger intelligence analysts treated her with the kind of polite deference usually reserved for museum pieces. They asked respectful questions about how things used to be done, and listened to her answers with the patient attention people give to elderly relatives sharing stories about the old days. None of them seemed particularly interested in her assessments of current regional dynamics or her observations about subtle shifts in diplomatic language that might indicate changing political alignments. Captain Jennifer Walsh, a rising star in the intelligence community, was particularly dismissive in her politely professional way. Walsh had earned her reputation through her mastery of digital intelligence gathering and her ability to synthesize vast amounts of electronic data into actionable reports. At 32, she commanded respect from her peers and superiors alike, and she made it clear that she viewed traditional human intelligence methods as charmingly antiquated. "Colonel Chen brings such valuable historical context to our discussions," Walsh would say during briefings, her tone suggesting that historical context was roughly equivalent to interesting but irrelevant trivia. The real work of threat assessment and strategic analysis happened in secured conference rooms that Margaret was no longer invited to enter. She caught glimpses of the activity through windows as she walked to her basement office. Officers huddled around computer screens displaying satellite imagery, walls covered with digital maps showing troop movements and communications intercepts. Analysts wearing headphones as they monitored electronic signals from across the European continent. Margaret's exclusion from these activities was never explicitly stated, but it was made clear through the architecture of access. Her keycard didn't open the doors to the main intelligence center. Her computer terminal couldn't access the classified networks where current threat assessments were maintained. Her phone extension wasn't included in the conference calls where strategic decisions were discussed. Instead, she found herself translating increasingly routine diplomatic correspondence and providing cultural background for meetings between NATO officials and their Eastern European counterparts. The work was competent but unchallenging, the kind of assignment designed to make use of someone's specialized skills, while ensuring they remained safely on the periphery of actual decision-making. During her second week, Margaret began to notice patterns in the diplomatic traffic that crossed her desk. Nothing dramatic or obviously significant, but subtle changes in tone and phrasing that suggested underlying tensions she wasn't seeing the full picture of. References to procedural adjustments in military exercises, mentions of technical consultations between defense ministries, and an increasing frequency of routine communications between various Eastern European capitals and Moscow. When she tried to discuss these observations with Major Kane, he listened politely and made notes on his tablet. "Interesting perspective, Colonel. I'll make sure to include your observations in my next report to General Morrison." But Margaret never saw any evidence that her concerns had been elevated beyond Kane's office. The patterns continued to develop, the language continued to shift, and the broader intelligence community continued to focus on the electronic signatures and satellite imagery that dominated their analytical frameworks. The basement office began to feel less like a workplace and more like a comfortable exile. Margaret translated documents, prepared cultural briefings that nobody seemed particularly interested in hearing, and watched through her single window as the real business of NATO intelligence continued. Without her input, she had been recalled to service, but it was becoming increasingly clear that she had not been recalled to serve any function that the current leadership considered essential. She was a gesture toward comprehensive expertise, a token acknowledgement that cultural understanding might occasionally prove useful, but not someone whose insights would be allowed to influence actual strategic thinking. Margaret Chen had spent 30 years learning to read the signs that others missed, to identify the subtle indicators that preceded major political and military developments. Now, as she sat in her basement office reviewing routine diplomatic correspondence, she was beginning to see signs that made her deeply concerned about what might be building beyond the comfortable certainty of electronic intelligence and algorithmic threat assessment, but in a world that had moved beyond the need for old-school human intelligence. Her concerns would have to wait for someone to ask the right questions. And based on her first 2 weeks back in uniform, Margaret was beginning to suspect that those questions might not be asked until it was already too late. The morning briefing room buzzed with the confident energy of officers who had never doubted their place in the modern military hierarchy. Margaret entered quietly, carrying a thin folder of translated documents that Major Kane had requested for the day's intelligence update. She took a seat near the back, close enough to hear the discussions, but far enough removed to make her secondary status clear to everyone present. General Patricia Morrison commanded the room with the authority of someone who had built her career on decisive action and technological superiority. At 49, she represented everything the modern NATO intelligence apparatus valued: advanced degrees in international relations and cybersecurity, extensive experience with drone operations and electronic warfare, and an unwavering faith in data-driven decision-making. Her presentations were models of precision, supported by satellite imagery, communications intercepts, and algorithmic analysis that could predict enemy movements with remarkable accuracy. Current threat assessment remained stable across all Eastern European sectors, Morrison announced, gesturing toward a wall-mounted display showing a digital map of the region. Green indicators marked friendly forces, yellow showed areas of routine monitoring, and a few scattered orange dots represented minor concerns that were being tracked through electronic surveillance. Captain Walsh stepped forward to provide the detailed briefing, her tablet connected wirelessly to the room's display systems. Charts and graphs materialized showing communications traffic, troop movement patterns, and what she described as baseline diplomatic activity between various regional capitals and Moscow. Electronic signal analysis indicates no significant deviations from established patterns, Walsh reported. Satellite imagery confirms that military exercises in Belarus and Western Russia are proceeding according to published schedules. Communications intercepts show routine coordination between defense ministries, nothing that raises immediate concerns. Margaret listened carefully, comparing Walsh's assessment with the documents she had been translating over the past several days. The electronic intelligence painted a picture of stability and predictability, but the human communications told a subtly different story. The language being used in diplomatic exchanges had been growing more formal, more careful, with an increasing emphasis on technical precision and procedural clarity. That suggested underlying tensions. During a brief pause in the presentation, Margaret raised her hand slightly. General Morrison, if I may offer an observation based on the diplomatic traffic I've been reviewing? Morrison's expression remained professionally neutral, but something in her posture suggested mild irritation. At the interruption, "Of course, Colonel Chen. What insights can you share from your translation work?" Margaret stood, opening her folder to reference specific documents. The language patterns in recent diplomatic correspondence suggest increasing formalization of communications between Eastern European capitals and Moscow. There's been a notable shift toward more rigid protocol language, particularly in discussions of military exercises and defense coordination. She paused, looking around the room, at faces that ranged from politely attentive to barely concealed impatience. In my experience, this type of linguistic shift often precedes significant policy changes or increased tensions that haven't yet manifested in observable military movements. Colonel James Fletcher, Morrison's deputy and a specialist in electronic warfare, leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone listening to an interesting but ultimately irrelevant historical anecdote. With respect, Colonel Chen, language analysis is certainly valuable for understanding cultural context, but our electronic surveillance provides real-time data on actual military capabilities and movements. If there were genuine threats developing, our systems would detect the observable indicators long before they appeared in diplomatic language. Several officers nodded in agreement. The modern intelligence community had invested heavily in technological solutions that could monitor enemy communications, track vehicle movements through satellite imagery, and analyze electronic signatures to predict military activity. The idea that subtle changes in diplomatic phrasing could provide early warning of threats that their sophisticated monitoring systems couldn't detect seemed almost quaintly old-fashioned. Captain Walsh consulted her tablet and added supportive data to Fletcher's dismissal. Our linguistic analysis algorithms process thousands of diplomatic communications daily, looking for keywords and sentiment patterns that might indicate escalating tensions. The current diplomatic traffic from the region shows sentiment scores well within normal parameters. Margaret felt the familiar frustration of someone trying to explain qualitative insights to people who had been trained to trust only quantitative data. The algorithms are certainly sophisticated, Captain Walsh, but they're designed to detect obvious indicators of hostility or crisis language. What I'm observing is more subtle, a shift toward the kind of formal precision that diplomats use when they're laying groundwork for actions they don't want to telegraph in advance. General Morrison checked her watch, a gesture that made clear the discussion was approaching its natural end. Colonel Chen, we appreciate your cultural perspective on these communications. I'll make sure your observations are included in the intelligence summary that goes to EUCOM headquarters. But Margaret could see in Morrison's expression the same polite dismissal she had been encountering since her return to active duty. Her insights would be noted, filed, and forgotten, while the real business of threat assessment continued to rely on the electronic systems that had become the backbone of modern military intelligence. The briefing continued with updates on cyber threats, discussions of supply chain logistics, and coordination with allied intelligence services. Margaret listened as officers described sophisticated monitoring systems that could track enemy communications, predict equipment maintenance schedules, and identify potential vulnerabilities in hostile networks. It was impressive technology, operated by competent professionals who had mastered the tools of 21st century warfare. When the briefing ended, Margaret remained in her seat as the room emptied around her. She reviewed her notes once more, cross-referencing the diplomatic language patterns she had been tracking with the confident assessments she had just heard from the intelligence community's rising stars. Walking back to her basement office, Margaret encountered Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kim, another member of the intelligence staff who had built her reputation on mastering the integration of artificial intelligence and human analysis. Kim was known for her ability to synthesize vast amounts of data from multiple sources, creating comprehensive threat assessments that impressed both superiors and allied intelligence services. "Interesting points you raised in the briefing, Colonel," Kim said as they walked together toward the elevator bank. "I've been working on some new analytical frameworks that might be able to incorporate the kind of cultural insights you mentioned into our broader assessment protocols." Margaret felt a moment of hope that someone might be interested in seriously considering her observations. "I'd be happy to discuss the patterns I've been seeing," There are subtleties in diplomatic language that don't always translate well into algorithmic analysis. Kim nodded thoughtfully. The challenge is finding ways to quantify cultural indicators so they can be integrated with our other data streams. If we could develop metrics for measuring diplomatic formality or linguistic precision, we might be able to incorporate those insights into our predictive models. The conversation continued as they entered the elevator, but Margaret gradually realized that Kim's interest lay not in understanding the qualitative insights themselves, but in finding ways to convert them into quantifiable data points that could feed into existing analytical systems. It was a sophisticated approach that acknowledged the potential value of cultural intelligence while ensuring it remained subordinate to the technological frameworks that dominated modern threat assessment. The problem with traditional human intelligence, Kim explained as they reached Margaret's floor, is that it's inherently subjective. Personal experience and cultural knowledge are valuable, but they need to be systematized and validated against objective data before they can contribute to operational decision-making. Margaret nodded politely and thanked Kim for her interest, but as she walked toward her office, she reflected on the fundamental disconnect between the intelligence communities' current approach and the kind of insights that had served her well throughout her career. The young officers she worked with weren't incompetent or dismissive out of malice. They were products of a system that had convinced them that technological solutions could replace the messy business of actually understanding how people think and communicate. Back in her basement office, Margaret spread out the diplomatic documents she had been translating over the past week. The pattern was becoming clearer with each passing day. Communications that were technically routine, but phrased with an increasing emphasis on precision, coordination, and technical requirements that seemed designed to establish frameworks for actions that weren't being explicitly discussed. She pulled out a legal pad and began mapping the timeline of linguistic changes, cross-referencing them with the electronic intelligence summaries she was occasionally allowed to see. The satellite imagery showed routine military exercises. The communications intercepts revealed normal coordination between allied defense ministries, and the algorithmic analysis suggested stable diplomatic relationships. But the language itself told a different story. Diplomats and military officials were speaking with the kind of careful precision that Margaret had learned to recognize as preparation for significant action. They were laying groundwork, establishing protocols, and creating communication frameworks that could support operations they weren't yet ready to announce. Margaret had seen this pattern before, in the months preceding conflicts that had surprised intelligence communities who relied too heavily on observable indicators and not enough on understanding the human dynamics that drove political and military decision-making. But in her current position, with her limited access to current intelligence and her diminished credibility within the command structure, she was finding it difficult to get anyone to take her concerns seriously. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her analysis. Major Kane's voice carried the tone of someone managing routine administrative tasks. "Colonel Chen, I need you to prepare a cultural briefing for tomorrow's visit from the Hungarian defense attaché. Standard protocol overview. Nothing too detailed. The meeting is scheduled for 1400 hours in conference room B." Margaret confirmed the assignment and returned to her documents, but Kane's casual dismissal of her request for nothing too detailed reinforced her growing understanding of how she was perceived within the current intelligence hierarchy. She had become a specialist in providing background information that was considered useful but not essential, cultural context that was interesting but not operationally significant. As afternoon faded into evening, Margaret remained at her desk, continuing to map the patterns she was seeing in diplomatic communications. The basement office grew quiet around her, but through her window, she could see lights burning in the main intelligence building where younger officers worked late into the night, processing electronic data and preparing assessments that would shape NATO's understanding of current threats. "Margaret, Chen had spent 3 decades learning to read the signs that preceded major political and military developments. Now, as she sat alone in her basement office, she was beginning to see indicators of something significant building in Eastern Europe. But in a military intelligence community that had moved beyond the need for old-fashioned human insights, her concerns would remain buried in routine reports until observable indicators finally caught up with the human dynamics that were already setting dangerous events in motion. The pattern of exclusion solidified over the following weeks with the kind of institutional efficiency that made discrimination feel like natural order. Margaret found herself increasingly relegated to what Major Kane diplomatically termed specialized cultural support functions, a phrase that encompassed everything from translating lunch menus for visiting dignitaries to providing historical background on regional customs that nobody seemed particularly interested in implementing. The morning staff meetings became exercises in professional invisibility. Margaret would arrive precisely on time, take her designated seat near the conference room door, and listen as the intelligence community's brightest minds discussed threats and opportunities across the European theater. Her presence was acknowledged with polite nods, but her input was neither solicited nor welcomed during the substantive discussions that determined NATO's strategic posture. Captain Walsh had emerged as the unofficial spokesperson for the new generation of intelligence professionals, and her presentations dominated these morning briefings with impressive displays of technological sophistication. Multi-layered satellite imagery revealed enemy troop movements with remarkable precision. Electronic surveillance captured communications between hostile actors in real time, and algorithmic analysis predicted probable courses of action with mathematical confidence that left little room for doubt or alternative interpretation. Current assessment indicates stable conditions across all monitored sectors, Walsh announced during a typical briefing, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been wrong about anything significant. Electronic signature analysis shows normal patterns of military communication between Russian Federation forces and their Eastern European counterparts. Satellite imagery confirms that recent exercises concluded on schedule without unexpected equipment movements or personnel deployments. General Morrison nodded approvingly as charts and graphs supported Walsh's conclusions with impressive precision. Communications intercepts showed routine coordination between defense ministries, logistics tracking revealed normal supply chain operations, and behavioral analysis algorithms suggested that key decision-makers were operating within predictable parameters. Margaret listened carefully, comparing these assessments with the documents that continued to cross her desk for translation. The disconnect was becoming more pronounced with each passing day. While electronic intelligence painted a picture of routine stability, the diplomatic communications revealed increasingly formal language patterns that suggested careful preparation for something that wasn't being discussed in channels accessible to NATO surveillance. During a brief pause in Walsh's presentation, Margaret raised her hand with the kind of reluctant persistence that came from professional duty rather than personal comfort. Captain Walsh, I've been tracking some linguistic patterns in diplomatic traffic that might warrant consideration alongside your electronic analysis. Walsh's expression remained professionally neutral, but her slight pause before responding suggested mild annoyance at the interruption. Of course, Colonel Chen. What cultural insights can you share that might supplement our technical assessment? Margaret opened her folder, revealing weeks of handwritten notes that looked almost primitive compared to the digital displays surrounding them. The formality index in communications between Moscow and regional capitals has increased by approximately 30% over the past month. Diplomatic language is shifting toward what I would characterize as procedural precision, the kind of careful phrasing that typically precedes significant policy implementations. She looked around the room at faces that ranged from politely interested to barely concealed impatience. Additionally, there's been an increase in references to technical consultations and procedural adjustments that don't correspond to any observable military activities your surveillance systems have identified. Colonel Fletcher, Morrison's deputy, consulted his tablet before responding with the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a confused student. Colonel Chen, while linguistic analysis certainly has its place in cultural intelligence, our electronic monitoring systems provide objective data on actual military capabilities and intentions. If significant threats were developing, we would see corresponding increases in communications traffic, unusual equipment movements, or changes in deployment patterns. He gestured toward the wall display showing satellite imagery of Eastern European military installations. Our surveillance networks monitor thousands of communications channels simultaneously, tracking not just the content of messages but their frequency, routing patterns, and electronic signatures. The current data shows normal operational tempo across all monitored sectors. Lieutenant Colonel Kim, who had previously expressed interest in incorporating cultural insights into analytical frameworks, added her support to Fletcher's assessment. We've also been running sentiment analysis algorithms on diplomatic communications, measuring emotional indicators and stress patterns in official correspondence. The current readings show diplomatic relationships operating within normal parameters. Margaret felt the familiar frustration of someone trying to explain nuanced observations to people who had been trained to trust only quantifiable data. The algorithms are sophisticated, but they're calibrated to detect obvious indicators of hostility or crisis. What I'm observing is more subtle, diplomatic preparation for actions that haven't been decided yet, but for which groundwork is being established. General Morrison checked her watch, a gesture that had become her standard method for indicating when discussions were approaching their natural conclusion. Colonel Chen, your cultural perspective is certainly valuable for understanding regional dynamics. I'll make sure your observations are included in our weekly intelligence summary. But Margaret recognized the tone of polite dismissal that had become routine in her interactions with the command structure. Her insights would be noted, filed, and ignored while the real business of threat assessment continued to rely on the electronic systems that had become the foundation of modern military intelligence. After the briefing, Margaret found herself walking back to her basement office alongside Captain Rodriguez, a junior intelligence officer who specialized in cyber threat assessment. Rodriguez was one of the few people who had shown genuine interest in Margaret's background, asking respectful questions about her experiences in Kosovo and her work developing human intelligence networks during the early stages of the war on terror. Your points about diplomatic language patterns are interesting, Rodriguez said as they waited for the elevator. I've been working on some projects that might benefit from that kind of cultural context. Margaret felt a moment of hope that someone might be willing to consider her observations seriously. What kind of projects? Rodriguez lowered his voice as other officers passed by in the hallway. Cyber penetration analysis. We've been tracking unusual patterns in Eastern European computer networks. Nothing that suggests immediate threats, but some anomalies that don't fit our normal analytical frameworks. The elevator arrived, and they stepped inside along with several other officers who were discussing weekend plans and family obligations. Rodriguez waited until they were alone before continuing. The technical indicators are subtle, he explained. Increased security protocols at certain government facilities, changes in network access patterns, and some communications routing that doesn't match normal operational procedures. Nothing that rises to the level of actionable intelligence, but enough to suggest that something might be developing below the threshold of our standard monitoring systems. Margaret listened carefully, recognizing in Rodriguez's observations the same kind of pattern recognition that had driven her own concerns about diplomatic language changes. Have you shared these findings with the intelligence staff? Rodriguez shrugged with the expression of someone who had learned the limitations of his position within the organizational hierarchy. I've included them in my routine cyber threat Reports, but they're considered background information rather than priority intelligence. Without clear indicators of hostile intent or specific threat activities, the leadership tends to focus on more obvious concerns. They reached Margaret's floor, and as she prepared to exit the elevator, Rodriguez handed her a business card. If you'd be interested in discussing your linguistic observations in relation to some of these cyber patterns, I think there might be connections that neither of us is seeing in isolation. Margaret accepted the card gratefully, recognizing in Rodriguez someone who understood that modern threats might not always manifest in ways that established analytical frameworks were designed to detect. It was the first time since her return to active duty that anyone had suggested her insights might contribute to understanding current security challenges rather than simply providing historical context. Back in her basement office, Margaret spread out the week's diplomatic documents alongside the routine intelligence summaries she was occasionally allowed to review. The electronic intelligence continued to show stable conditions across all monitored sectors, but the human communications revealed increasingly careful coordination between various Eastern European capitals and Moscow. The telephone rang, interrupting her analysis. Major Kane's voice carried his typical tone of administrative efficiency. "Colonel Chen, I need you to prepare a cultural overview for next week's NATO-Russia Council meeting. Historical background on diplomatic protocols, traditional negotiation styles, that sort of thing. Nothing that touches on current operational matters." Margaret confirmed the assignment, but Kane's emphasis on avoiding current operational matters reinforced her understanding of how severely her access to meaningful intelligence work had been restricted. She had been reduced to providing historical context and cultural background, while remaining carefully isolated from the analytical processes that shaped NATO's understanding of contemporary threats. As evening approached, Margaret remained at her desk, continuing to map the patterns she was seeing in diplomatic communications. The basement office grew quiet around her, but through her window, she could see activity continuing in the main intelligence building where younger officers processed electronic data and prepared assessments that would influence military planning. Across the European theater, her handwritten notes covered several pages now, tracking the evolution of diplomatic language patterns over the past month. The formality was increasing. The references to technical procedures were becoming more frequent, and the overall tone suggested careful preparation for actions that weren't being discussed in channels accessible to NATO surveillance. Margaret had seen similar patterns before, in the months preceding conflicts that had surprised intelligence communities who relied too heavily on electronic indicators and not enough on understanding the human dynamics that drove political and military decision-making. But in her current position, with her limited access to current intelligence and her diminished credibility within the command structure, she was finding it impossible to get anyone to take her concerns seriously. The patterns were becoming clearer with each passing day, but Margaret Chen was beginning to understand that her warnings would remain buried in routine reports until electronic intelligence finally detected the observable indicators that would validate her concerns. By then, however, the careful diplomatic preparation she was tracking might have already produced consequences that sophisticated monitoring systems couldn't prevent. In a military intelligence community that had moved beyond the need for old-fashioned human insights, Margaret's expertise had become a liability rather than an asset. She could see the signs that others were missing, but she lacked the institutional authority to ensure that anyone would listen until it was too late to matter. The breakthrough came at 3:15 on a Tuesday morning, buried in a routine diplomatic cable that Major Kane had assigned to Margaret for translation as part of what he called routine linguistic maintenance. The document appeared to be standard correspondence between the Hungarian Ministry of Defense and their Russian counterparts, discussing technical specifications for a joint communications exercise scheduled for the following month. But as Margaret worked through the translation, Certain phrases began to stand out with the kind of significance that only someone with 3 decades of intelligence experience would recognize. References to enhanced coordination protocols and expanded technical parameters were embedded within discussions of routine military communications testing. More importantly, the language structure suggested that this was not actually about communications exercises at all. Margaret had encountered similar diplomatic coding during her years analyzing Soviet-era intelligence, when sensitive operations were discussed using mundane technical language that appeared innocuous to casual observation but conveyed specific operational meaning to intended recipients. The Hungarian cable was employing the same kind of linguistic camouflage, using communications exercise terminology to discuss something far more significant. She spent the remainder of the night cross-referencing the cable with similar documents from the past month, building a comprehensive picture of what appeared to be coordinated preparation across multiple Eastern European defense ministries. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable once properly analyzed. Routine military exercises were being used as cover for establishing ENHANCED coordination protocols that could support operations far beyond their stated scope. When the morning briefing convened, Margaret arrived with a folder containing detailed analysis of the linguistic patterns she had identified. General Morrison opened the session with her standard review of electronic intelligence, supported by Captain Walsh's presentation of satellite imagery and communications intercepts that continued to show normal operational tempo across all monitored sectors. Current threat assessment remains at baseline levels, Morrison announced, gesturing toward displays showing routine military activities throughout Eastern Europe. Electronic surveillance indicates no unusual patterns in enemy communications or equipment movements. Allied intelligence services report similar assessments of regional stability. Margaret waited for the appropriate moment before raising her hand to request permission to address the briefing. Morrison acknowledged her with the kind of polite attention typically reserved for routine administrative matters. General Morrison, I've identified some concerning patterns in diplomatic communications that suggest coordinated preparation for operations that extend beyond the scope of announced military exercises. Margaret opened her folder and began reading directly from her translation notes. Yesterday's cable from the Hungarian Defense Ministry to Moscow contained references to enhanced coordination protocols and expanded technical parameters within discussions of routine communications testing. Similar language has appeared in correspondence from Polish and Czech defense ministries over the past 2 weeks. She looked around the room at faces that showed varying degrees of polite interest and professional skepticism. In my assessment, this language pattern indicates preparation for coordinated military operations that are being camouflaged as routine training exercises. Colonel Fletcher consulted his tablet before responding with the patient tone he typically employed when addressing what he considered outdated analytical methods. Colonel Chen, while linguistic analysis can provide useful cultural context, our electronic monitoring systems would detect any actual coordination between hostile forces. Communications intercepts show normal training exercise coordination. Satellite imagery confirms that announced exercises are proceeding according to published schedules. Captain Walsh added supporting data from her comprehensive surveillance networks. Our signals intelligence platforms monitor thousands of communications channels simultaneously, including the specific cables Colonel Chen has translated. Algorithmic analysis of those communications shows normal diplomatic language patterns without indicators of hostile intent or operational deception. Margaret felt the familiar frustration of trying to explain qualitative intelligence insights to people who trusted only quantifiable data. The algorithms are designed to detect obvious deception indicators, but this type of operational camouflage employs routine diplomatic language to convey coded meaning that doesn't trigger standard analysis protocols. Lieutenant Colonel Kim, who had previously expressed interest in incorporating cultural insights into analytical frameworks, offered what sounded like support, but actually represented another form of dismissal. Colonel Chen raises interesting points about the limitations of algorithmic analysis. Perhaps we could develop enhanced linguistic protocols that would allow our systems to detect the kind of subtle patterns she's describing. But Margaret recognized that Kim's suggestion was another attempt to convert human intelligence insights into technological solutions rather than acknowledging that some forms of analysis required experienced human judgment that couldn't be replicated by even the most sophisticated algorithms. General Morrison checked her watch, signaling the approaching end of productive discussion. Colonel Chen, I appreciate your detailed analysis of diplomatic communications. I'll make sure your concerns are forwarded to UCOM intelligence staff for their consideration. Margaret understood that her warnings would be filed alongside other routine intelligence reports where they would remain until electronic surveillance systems finally detected the observable indicators that would validate her analysis. But by then, whatever operations were being prepared through careful diplomatic coordination might already be underway. After the briefing, Margaret found herself walking back toward her basement office alongside several other officers who were discussing their upcoming assignments and weekend plans. The conversation was friendly and professional, but Margaret noticed that none of them asked about her analysis or expressed interest in understanding the specific indicators that had prompted her concerns. Captain Rodriguez appeared at her elbow. As they reached the elevator bank, speaking quietly to avoid being overheard by the other officers. Your points about operational camouflage were interesting. I've been tracking some related anomalies in cybersecurity networks that might connect to what you're seeing in diplomatic communications. Margaret felt a moment of hope that someone was taking her analysis seriously. What kind of anomalies? Rodriguez waited until they were alone in the elevator before continuing. Enhanced security protocols at government facilities across Eastern Europe, unusual patterns in network access permissions, and some communications routing changes that don't correspond to announced exercise activities. Nothing that indicates immediate threats, but enough to suggest preparation for operations that extend beyond routine training. The elevator reached Margaret's floor, but before she could exit, Rodriguez handed her a sealed envelope. I've prepared a detailed technical analysis of the cyber indicators I've been tracking. If you're willing to compare your linguistic findings with my technical data, we might be able to develop a more comprehensive threat assessment. Margaret accepted the envelope gratefully, recognizing in Rodriguez someone who understood that modern security challenges might require integration of multiple analytical approaches rather than reliance on any single technological solution. Back in her basement office, Margaret opened Rodriguez's envelope to find detailed charts and graphs showing cybersecurity anomalies across Eastern European government networks. The technical data was impressive, revealing subtle patterns of enhanced protection protocols and modified access procedures that suggested preparation for sensitive operations. More importantly, Rodriguez's timeline of cybersecurity changes corresponded almost exactly with the linguistic patterns Margaret had been tracking in diplomatic communications. Enhanced coordination protocols were being established in both digital and diplomatic channels simultaneously, creating redundant preparation frameworks that could support operations requiring both technical and political coordination. Margaret spread both analyses across her desk, mapping the correlation between linguistic and technical indicators. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Multiple Eastern European defense ministries were engaging in coordinated preparation for operations that extended far beyond the scope of routine military exercises. The telephone rang, interrupting her analysis. Major Kane's voice carried the routine administrative tone she had learned to associate with assignments designed to keep her occupied with peripheral activities. Colonel Chen, I need you to prepare historical background materials for next month's NATO Partnership Summit. Traditional diplomatic protocols, regional customs, that sort of thing. The meeting planners want comprehensive cultural context for the visiting delegations. Margaret confirmed the assignment, but Kane's emphasis on historical background and traditional protocols reinforced her understanding that she was being deliberately isolated from contemporary intelligence analysis. Her concerns about current threat indicators would remain buried in routine reports, while she prepared cultural briefings for ceremonial functions. As afternoon faded into evening, Margaret continued comparing Rodriguez's cyber analysis with her own linguistic findings. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental, and the scope of coordination too extensive to represent routine training activities. Something significant was being prepared across multiple Eastern European defense establishments, using both diplomatic and technical channels to establish operational frameworks that weren't being discussed in communications. Accessible to NATO surveillance, Margaret had spent 3 decades learning to recognize the early indicators of major political and military developments. The pattern she was seeing now suggested preparation for coordinated action that could fundamentally alter the security balance in Eastern Europe. But in her current position, with her limited access to current intelligence and her diminished credibility within the command structure, she was finding it impossible to get anyone to take her warnings seriously. The diplomatic cables continued to arrive for translation, each one containing additional evidence of careful coordination between defense ministries that were supposedly engaged in routine training exercises. References to enhanced technical parameters and expanded coordination protocols appeared with increasing frequency, always embedded within discussions of mundane administrative matters that would appear harmless to algorithmic analysis. Margaret's handwritten notes now covered dozens of pages, documenting a comprehensive pattern of diplomatic and technical preparation that suggested operations far more significant than anything NATO's electronic surveillance systems were detecting. But without institutional authority to demand serious consideration of her analysis, her warnings would remain trapped in the basement office where she had been assigned to provide cultural context rather than strategic intelligence. The signs were becoming clearer every day. But Margaret Chen was learning that expertise without institutional power was often indistinguishable from irrelevant background noise. She could see what others were missing, but she couldn't force them to listen until their own technological systems finally detected the obvious indicators that would validate her concerns. By then, however, the careful preparation she was documenting might have already produced consequences that even the most sophisticated monitoring systems couldn't prevent or contain. The crisis erupted at 4:30-7 in the morning when encrypted communications from 3 separate NATO intelligence stations simultaneously reported unprecedented military movements across Eastern Europe. Margaret was in her basement office, having arrived early to continue her analysis of the diplomatic patterns she had been tracking, when the base-wide alert system activated with the harsh electronic tone that indicated immediate threat escalation. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in red as personnel rushed toward their crisis stations. Margaret could hear boots pounding on concrete above her as officers reported to the main intelligence center, their voices carrying the controlled urgency of professionals trained to respond quickly to developing situations. Through her small window, she watched vehicles racing across the compound toward secure communication facilities that would coordinate NATO's response to whatever was unfolding. The secure telephone network crackled with overlapping reports from intelligence stations across the European theater. Satellite imagery revealed massive troop movements that had begun under cover of darkness, with Russian and Eastern European forces deploying along borders in configurations that bore no resemblance to the routine training exercises that had been scheduled for the region. Margaret's keycard still didn't grant her access to the main intelligence center, but she could monitor some communications through the secondary systems in her basement office. The reports were fragmentary but alarming. Mechanized divisions moving toward Polish borders, electronic warfare units activating sophisticated jamming systems, and naval forces positioning themselves in the Baltic Sea with deployment patterns that suggested preparation for coordinated military action. Major, Kane's voice echoed through the compound's intercom system, summoning all personnel to emergency stations and implementing crisis protocols that hadn't been activated since the height of the Cold War. But Margaret noticed that her name wasn't included in the list of officers reporting to the main command center where strategic responses were being coordinated. Instead, she remained in her basement office, monitoring secondary communications while the intelligence community's technological elite struggled to understand how such massive military movements could have been initiated without triggering their sophisticated early warning systems. The electronic surveillance networks that had been tracking routine training exercises were now reporting G-troop deployments that suggested preparation for full-scale military operations. Morrison's voice cut through the communication chaos, demanding immediate analysis of how NATO intelligence had failed to detect preparation for operations of this magnitude. Captain Walsh and her team were scrambling to review electronic intercepts from the past month, searching for indicators they might have missed while confident in their technological superiority. How did we miss this? Morrison's frustration was evident even through the crackling intercom system. Our surveillance networks monitor every communications channel, track every vehicle movement, analyze every electronic signature. These deployments require months of coordination that should have been visible to our monitoring systems. Colonel Fletcher's response revealed the depth of their analytical failure. Generally, our electronic intelligence shows that announced training exercises proceeded exactly according to published schedules. Communications intercepts revealed normal coordination between defense ministries. Satellite imagery confirmed that equipment movements matched exercise requirements. But Margaret understood what had happened with the clarity that comes from having predicted exactly this scenario. The routine training exercises had been genuine, but they had also provided cover for establishing the coordination protocols and logistical frameworks necessary to support the massive military operations that were now unfolding across Eastern Europe. The diplomatic communications she had been translating for weeks had laid the groundwork for this crisis. References to enhanced coordination protocols and expanded technical parameters had established the administrative and operational frameworks that allowed multiple defense ministries to coordinate unprecedented military deployments while maintaining the appearance of routine training activities. Margaret's analysis had identified the early indicators of this crisis, but her warnings had been dismissed as outdated cultural observations that couldn't compete with the sophisticated electronic surveillance systems that formed the backbone of modern military intelligence. Now those same systems were reporting developments they had failed to predict because they couldn't detect the human coordination that had made such operations possible. The telephone in her basement office rang with the distinctive tone that indicated priority communications. Captain Rodriguez's voice carried the controlled panic of someone watching catastrophic intelligence failure unfold in real time. Colonel Chen, I need you in the secondary analysis center immediately. General Morrison is demanding a comprehensive review of all intelligence sources, and your linguistic analysis might be the only thing that explains how we missed indicators of this magnitude. Margaret gathered her months of handwritten notes and headed toward the secondary analysis center, a secure facility she had never been authorized to enter during normal operations. The corridors were filled with personnel rushing between communication stations, their faces reflecting the kind of professional urgency that accompanies major intelligence failures. The secondary analysis center buzzed with activity as officers attempted to reconstruct the timeline of events that had led to the current crisis. Wall-mounted displays showed real-time satellite imagery of troop movements that were continuing to expand across Eastern Europe, while communications specialists worked frantically to understand how such massive coordination had occurred without detection. Rodriguez met her at the entrance, his expression grim with the realization that technological superiority had proven inadequate for detecting threats that relied on human coordination rather than electronic communication. "We need your linguistic analysis immediately." The diplomatic communications you've been tracking might be the only source of intelligence that predicted this crisis. Margaret spread her handwritten notes across an available table, revealing months of careful analysis that had documented the gradual establishment of coordination protocols between Eastern European defense ministries and Moscow. The pattern was clear once properly examined. Routine diplomatic language had been used to establish operational frameworks that could support exactly the kind of military coordination that was now unfolding. General Morrison appeared at the analysis table, her professional composure strained by the magnitude of the intelligence failure she was confronting. "Colonel Chen, I need you to explain how your linguistic analysis relates to current military developments." Margaret opened her folder to reveal the comprehensive timeline she had constructed over the past month. "General, the diplomatic communications. I've been translating established coordination protocols that were designed to support operations far beyond routine training exercises. References to enhanced technical parameters and expanded coordination procedures created administrative frameworks for the military deployments we're seeing now." She pointed to specific documents that corresponded with current troop movements. Each of these cables established coordination agreements between specific defense ministries and Russian military commands. The language appeared routine to algorithmic analysis, but it actually created legal and operational foundations for unprecedented military cooperation. Morrison studied the documents with a growing understanding of how sophisticated operational deception had defeated NATO's most advanced surveillance systems. "You're saying that routine diplomatic correspondence was used to coordinate military operations that our electronic intelligence couldn't detect?" Margaret nodded, pointing to the correlation between her linguistic timeline and the current crisis developments. "The diplomatic preparation began 6 weeks ago and accelerated over the past month. Every major troop movement we're seeing now was enabled by coordination agreements that were established through routine diplomatic channels." Colonel Fletcher appeared at the analysis table, his confidence in technological solutions visibly shaken by the scope of the intelligence failure he was witnessing. "How did our algorithmic analysis miss indicators this significant?" Margaret had spent weeks trying to explain this exact problem to people who preferred quantifiable data over qualitative insights. The algorithms were designed to detect obvious deception indicators, but this operation used routine diplomatic language to establish genuine coordination agreements. There was no electronic deception because the coordination was happening through legitimate diplomatic channels. Captain Walsh joined the discussion, her tablet displaying the electronic intelligence assessments that had failed to predict the current crisis. "Our surveillance systems monitored the exact communications Colonel Chen analyzed, but our algorithmic analysis classified them as routine diplomatic traffic." Margaret recognized the opportunity to finally explain the limitations of purely technological approaches to intelligence analysis. Sophisticated operational deception doesn't rely on hiding communications. It relies on conducting genuine coordination through channels that appear routine to automated analysis but carry coded operational meaning for intended recipients. The analysis continued throughout the morning as Margaret walked the intelligence staff through months of diplomatic preparation that had established the foundations for the crisis they were now confronting. Each document in her collection corresponded to specific aspects of the military operations that were continuing to unfold across Eastern Europe. General Morrison's expression grew increasingly grim as she understood the comprehensive nature of the intelligence failure her command had experienced. Colonel Chen, how long have you been tracking these patterns? Margaret consulted her timeline of analysis efforts. I identified the initial indicators 6 weeks ago and attempted to raise concerns through appropriate channels. The pattern became increasingly clear over the past month, but my warnings were classified as cultural observations rather than actionable intelligence. The room fell silent as the intelligence staff absorbed the implications of Margaret's statement. Months of careful diplomatic preparation had established the coordination frameworks for a major military crisis. But NATO's most sophisticated surveillance systems had failed to detect the threat because they couldn't analyze the human coordination that made such operations possible. Margaret Chen had identified the early indicators of this crisis and attempted to warn the intelligence community through appropriate channels, but her expertise had been dismissed as outdated cultural analysis that couldn't compete with technological solutions. Now the same people who had ignored her warnings were struggling to understand how their electronic systems had failed to predict developments that careful human analysis had detected. Weeks in advance, the crisis was unfolding exactly as Margaret's linguistic analysis had predicted, but NATO's response was being hampered by the same institutional biases that had prevented them from recognizing the threat in the first place. They were fighting a war that had been planned in diplomatic language while trusting technological systems that couldn't understand the human dynamics driving the conflict. Margaret stepped forward to the primary communications console with the same steady composure she had maintained throughout 6 weeks of dismissal and marginalization. The main intelligence center had become a storm of overlapping voices, flashing warning lights, and the controlled chaos of military professionals confronting a crisis that had exceeded all their technological predictions. General Morrison moved aside without hesitation, recognizing that traditional command structures had become inadequate for managing a situation that their most advanced systems had failed to anticipate. Around them, officers struggled with electronic displays showing troop movements that continued to expand beyond anything their algorithmic models had predicted possible. Colonel Chen, Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of command. Authority transferred under crisis conditions. You have operational control of threat analysis. Tell us what we're really facing. Margaret settled at the communication station and began integrating her linguistic analysis with the real time intelligence flowing through NATO's monitoring networks. The diplomatic preparation she had been tracking for weeks was now manifesting as coordinated military action across multiple theaters. But the human coordination behind these movements was still invisible to the electronic systems that dominated modern intelligence gathering. Her fingers moved across the console with practiced efficiency, pulling up communication intercepts that corresponded to the diplomatic framework she had identified. Each troop movement, each logistics coordination, each tactical deployment was traceable to specific agreements that had been established through routine diplomatic channels over the past month. The current operations are proceeding according to coordination protocols established through diplomatic correspondence beginning 6 weeks ago, Margaret announced to the assembled intelligence staff. Russian and Eastern European forces are implementing predetermined deployment patterns that were negotiated through routine Defense Ministry communications. She highlighted specific communications that corresponded to ongoing military movements. This mechanized division moving toward the Polish border was coordinated through a technical consultation agreement established 3 weeks ago. The electronic warfare units activating jamming systems were positioned according to protocols discussed in routine communications exercise planning. Captain Walsh approached the console, her confidence in technological solutions visibly shaken by the comprehensive intelligence failure she was witnessing. Colonel Chen, how do we counter operations that were coordinated through channels our surveillance systems classified as routine diplomatic traffic? Margaret understood that the question revealed the fundamental weakness in NATO's intelligence approach. Their sophisticated monitoring systems could detect electronic signatures and track observable movements, but they couldn't analyze the human coordination that enabled sophisticated military operations. The key is understanding that this isn't a traditional military operation coordinated through command channels we can monitor, Margaret explained while continuing to correlate diplomatic communications with current deployments. This is a political operation that uses military assets according to agreements established through legitimate diplomatic processes. She pulled up additional communications that revealed the true scope of the coordination she had been tracking. Each participating defense ministry has legal authorization for their current activities, based on technical cooperation agreements that were negotiated over the past month. From their perspective, they're implementing legitimate defense coordination, rather than conducting hostile operations. Colonel Fletcher studied the diplomatic documents with a growing understanding of how traditional military intelligence had been rendered inadequate by sophisticated political coordination. You're saying these deployments are legally authorized by agreements that our systems classified as routine administrative coordination? Margaret nodded while highlighting additional correspondence that demonstrated the comprehensive nature of the diplomatic preparation. The legal frameworks were established first, followed by technical coordination protocols, and finally by logistics agreements that enabled the military deployments we're seeing now. Each step appeared routine when analyzed in isolation, but together they created operational capabilities that exceed anything we've seen since the Cold War. Lieutenant Colonel Kim approached the analysis station, her expertise in technological integration challenged by developments that had defeated the most sophisticated algorithmic analysis systems. How do we develop countermeasures against coordination that operates through legitimate diplomatic channels? Margaret recognized that Kim's question addressed the fundamental limitation of purely technological approaches to modern security challenges. Traditional countermeasures assume hostile intent that can be detected through electronic surveillance. But these operations were coordinated through diplomatic agreements that were genuinely routine from a legal and administrative perspective. The communications console displayed additional intercepts that revealed the continuing expansion of coordinated military activities across Eastern Europe. Margaret analyzed each new development in the context of the diplomatic preparation she had been tracking, providing the intelligence staff with predictive capabilities that their electronic systems couldn't match. Based on the coordination protocols I've identified, we can expect additional deployments in 3 specific sectors over the next 12 hours, Margaret announced while highlighting corresponding diplomatic agreements. The Baltic naval operations will expand according to technical cooperation protocols established 2 weeks ago. Mechanized units will advance to positions predetermined through routine exercise coordination agreements. General Morrison studied Margaret's analysis with the expression of someone recognizing expertise that should have been consulted months earlier. Colonel Chen, what are the strategic objectives behind these coordinated operations? Margaret pulled up the comprehensive timeline of diplomatic preparation that revealed the political logic driving the military deployments. The objective appears to be establishing new security arrangements in Eastern Europe through coordinated pressure that stops just short of triggering NATO's collective defense obligations. Each participating country has legal justification for their activities, but collectively they're creating military pressure that could force political concessions. She highlighted specific communications that revealed the sophisticated nature of the political strategy being implemented. The coordination was designed to create a crisis that appears to be multiple separate national decisions rather than coordinated hostile action. Traditional alliance responses become complicated when each individual action can be justified as legitimate defense cooperation. Captain Rodriguez joined the analysis group, his cybersecurity expertise providing additional context for understanding the comprehensive nature of the operation. The technical preparations support Colonel Chen's assessment. Enhanced security. Protocols and modified communications routing created redundant coordination capabilities that operate independently of channels we normally monitor. Margaret integrated Rodriguez's technical analysis with her diplomatic findings, revealing the full scope of the preparation that had enabled the current crisis. The coordination was established through 3 parallel channels: diplomatic agreements for legal authorization, technical protocols for secure communication, and logistics frameworks for operational implementation. Our surveillance systems monitored each channel separately but couldn't detect the integrated coordination. The intelligence staff worked throughout the afternoon to understand the implications of Margaret's analysis for NATO's strategic response options. Traditional military countermeasures were complicated by the legal frameworks that had been established through legitimate diplomatic processes, while political responses were hampered by the distributed nature of the coordination that made identifying primary responsibility difficult. Margaret continued to provide real-time analysis of developing situations based on her understanding of the diplomatic coordination driving the crisis. Her predictions proved accurate as additional deployments unfolded according to the predetermined protocols she had identified, while electronic surveillance systems struggled to understand coordination that operated through channels they had been trained to ignore. The next phase will involve economic coordination designed to reinforce the military pressure, Margaret announced after analyzing additional diplomatic correspondence. Trade agreements and energy cooperation protocols were established alongside the military coordination frameworks. Economic pressure will be applied through routine commercial decisions that collectively create significant strategic impact. General Morrison recognized that Margaret's analysis provided the only comprehensive understanding of a crisis that had defeated NATO's most advanced intelligence capabilities. Colonel Chen, what recommendations do you have for countering operations that were coordinated through channels our traditional systems can't effectively monitor? Margaret understood that the question addressed fundamental limitations in how modern military intelligence had evolved to rely on technological solutions rather than human analysis. Effective countermeasures require understanding the political logic driving the military operations. The coordination was designed to create pressure for political concessions, but it's also designed to avoid triggering responses that could escalate to actual warfare. She highlighted specific diplomatic communications that revealed potential vulnerabilities in the coordination frameworks. The legal authorizations were carefully constructed to avoid crossing specific threshold triggers for alliance responses. But the same careful legal structure creates dependencies on continued diplomatic cooperation that could be disrupted through appropriate political pressure. The analysis continued into the evening as Margaret walked the intelligence staff through potential response strategies based on her understanding of the diplomatic preparation that had enabled the crisis. Her expertise in human coordination provided insights that purely technological approaches couldn't match, while her understanding of Eastern European political dynamics offered response options that traditional military planning had overlooked. Margaret Chen had spent weeks trying to warn the intelligence community about the coordination she was detecting through routine diplomatic channels. Now the same people who had dismissed her concerns were relying on her analysis to understand a crisis that had exposed the limitations of their technological approach to modern security challenges. The quiet competence they had ignored was finally being recognized as exactly the expertise they needed to navigate threats that operated through human coordination rather than electronic communication. The revelation came through a priority communication channel that connected directly to the office of the NATO Secretary General, cutting through the chaos of the crisis response with the authority of the highest levels of Alliance Command. Margaret was coordinating response analysis when the encrypted transmission arrived, carrying authentication codes that granted immediate access to personnel records that had remained classified throughout her assignment at Ramstein. General Morrison received the transmission personally, her expression shifting from professional concern to something approaching shock as she reviewed the contents. Around the command center, junior officers continued their frantic efforts to track developing military situations, but Morrison's sudden stillness drew attention from senior staff, who recognized the significance of whatever information she was processing. "Colonel Chen," Morrison said, her voice carrying a tone that transformed the dynamic in the room immediately. "I need to speak with you privately." Margaret followed Morrison to a secure briefing room adjacent to the main command center. Aware that conversations occurring in such facilities were reserved for information that carried the highest classification levels, the soundproof environment felt suddenly intimate after hours of managing crisis coordination in the chaotic main center. Morrison activated additional security protocols before speaking, ensuring that their conversation would remain isolated from all monitoring systems. "Colonel Margaret Chen, serial number classified, Central Intelligence Agency, Strategic Analysis Division, Eastern European Desk Chief, 1995 to 2018. The words hung in the secure room like a revelation that recontextualized everything that had occurred over the past 2 months. Margaret's supposed retirement, her recall to routine liaison duties, her assignment to basement translation work, all of it had been elaborate operational cover for placement in a position where she could observe NATO intelligence capabilities without revealing her true credentials. "Your assignment here was coordinated between CIA and NATO intelligence as part of an ongoing assessment of alliance threat detection capabilities," Morrison continued, consulting documents that bore classification markings Margaret hadn't seen. Since her CIA days, the Eastern European crisis was identified as a potential threat 6 months ago, and your placement was designed to evaluate whether NATO systems would detect the kind of sophisticated coordination that characterizes modern hybrid warfare. Margaret absorbed this information with the professional calm that had defined her intelligence career, but internally she experienced the relief of understanding why her expertise had been so consistently dismissed. The younger officers hadn't been ignoring valuable insights. They had been unwittingly participating in an operational test designed to evaluate the limitations of their analytical frameworks. The dismissive treatment, the restricted access, the assignment to routine translation work, Morrison explained. All of it was designed to simulate the position of experienced analysts whose expertise might be undervalued by command structures that prioritize technological solutions over human intelligence. Margaret understood the broader implications of what Morrison was revealing. This was an assessment of institutional bias within NATO intelligence operations. Morrison nodded, her expression reflecting the gravity of what the assessment had revealed. "Your warnings about diplomatic coordination were transmitted through classified channels to senior alliance leadership throughout the crisis development. The question wasn't whether NATO intelligence could detect the threat, but whether institutional structures would allow experienced analysts to influence decision-making when their insights conflicted with technological assessments." The conversation was interrupted by urgent communication from the main command center, where Captain Walsh was reporting developments that validated Margaret's most dire predictions. "General Morrison, we're detecting economic coordination that corresponds exactly to Colonel Chen's analysis. Trade flows are being redirected according to predetermined agreements. Energy supplies are being adjusted through routine commercial decisions. And financial coordination is creating pressure that reinforces the military deployments." Morrison and Margaret returned to the main command center, where Margaret's true identity was revealed to the intelligence staff who had spent weeks dismissing her insights as outdated cultural observations. The transformation in their attitudes was immediate and dramatic, but Margaret recognized that institutional learning required more than individual acknowledgement of error. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced to the assembled intelligence staff. "Colonel Margaret Chen is Deputy Director of Strategic Analysis, Central Intelligence Agency, with specialized expertise in hybrid warfare coordination and Eastern European political dynamics. Her assignment here was coordinated with CIA leadership to assess NATO's ability to detect and respond to sophisticated political-military coordination." Captain Walsh approached Margaret with the expression of someone recognizing expertise that had been present throughout the crisis, but invisible due to institutional assumptions. "Ma'am, your analysis provided the only accurate prediction of current developments. Our technological systems detected all the individual components of the coordination, but we couldn't integrate them into a comprehensive threat assessment." Margaret understood that Walsh's acknowledgement represented broader recognition of the limitations inherent in purely technological approaches to modern intelligence challenges. "Captain Walsh, your electronic surveillance systems performed exactly as designed. The limitation wasn't technological capability, but analytical frameworks that couldn't process human coordination operating through legitimate diplomatic channels." Lieutenant Colonel Chen joined the discussion. Her expertise in technological integration now focused on understanding how human and electronic analysis could be more effectively combined. "Ma'am, how do we develop institutional capabilities that can integrate qualitative insights with quantitative data in ways that prevent the kind of intelligence failure we experienced?" Margaret recognized that Kim's question addressed fundamental challenges in how modern military institutions balance technological sophistication with human expertise. "The key is understanding that sophisticated threats often operate through legitimate processes that appear routine when analyzed separately, but create strategic vulnerabilities when coordinated systematically." Colonel Fletcher approached with documentation showing the comprehensive scope of the coordination that NATO systems had failed to detect until Margaret's analysis provided the interpretive framework. "Ma'am, the coordination protocols operated through channels that our monitoring systems classified as routine administrative traffic. How do we modify our analytical approaches to detect similar coordination in the future?" Margaret understood that Fletcher's question revealed institutional recognition that technological superiority alone couldn't provide adequate security against threats that operated through human coordination rather than electronic communication. Effective threat detection requires understanding the political logic that enables military coordination. Electronic surveillance can detect the mechanisms of coordination, but human analysis is necessary to understand the strategic purposes that drive sophisticated operations. The discussion continued as Margaret walked the intelligence staff through the comprehensive analysis she had been conducting throughout her assignment. Each diplomatic communication, each technical protocol, each logistics agreement had contributed to coordination capabilities that exceeded anything NATO's electronic systems had been designed to detect. The operation was designed specifically to exploit the gap between technological capabilities and human understanding. Margaret explained while reviewing the timeline of coordination development. Electronic surveillance detected all the individual components, but institutional bias prevented integration of insights that would have revealed the comprehensive threat. Captain Rodriguez contributed his analysis of the cybersecurity components that had supported the diplomatic coordination, revealing how technical and political preparation had been systematically integrated. The electronic warfare capabilities were established through legitimate technical cooperation agreements that our systems classified as routine defense coordination. Margaret integrated Rodriguez's findings with her diplomatic analysis, providing the intelligence staff with a comprehensive understanding of how modern hybrid warfare operated through coordination that appeared legitimate when analyzed through traditional technological frameworks. The success of the operation depended on NATO's reliance on electronic intelligence systems that couldn't detect political coordination operating through diplomatic channels. General Morrison addressed the broader implications of what the assessment had revealed about NATO intelligence capabilities. This exercise has demonstrated critical vulnerabilities in our analytical approaches that could be exploited by sophisticated adversaries who understand our technological biases. Margaret recognized that Morrison's statement represented institutional acknowledgement of the limitations inherent in intelligence communities that prioritized technological solutions over human expertise. General Morrison, the assessment reveals that effective modern intelligence requires integration of technological capabilities with human analysis that can understand the political dynamics driving sophisticated threats. The intelligence staff spent the remainder of the evening reviewing Margaret's analysis with the understanding that her insights represented not outdated cultural observations, but precisely the kind of strategic intelligence that modern threats were designed to exploit. The crisis had revealed fundamental limitations in how NATO approached intelligence analysis, but it had also demonstrated the continuing importance of human expertise in understanding threats that operated through political coordination rather than electronic communication. Margaret Chen's true identity had been revealed, but more importantly, the institutional biases that had prevented recognition of her expertise had been exposed as critical vulnerabilities that sophisticated adversaries could exploit. The quiet competence that had been dismissed as irrelevant had proven to be exactly the analytical capability that modern security challenges required, but only after a crisis that had threatened to escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. Secure conference room at NATO headquarters buzzed with urgent activity as senior alliance leadership grappled with the implications of the intelligence assessment that had exposed critical vulnerabilities in their threat detection capabilities. Margaret found herself at the center of discussions that would fundamentally reshape how the alliance approached modern security challenges. Secretary General Andreas Stoltenberg participated via encrypted video link from Brussels, his expression reflecting the gravity of institutional changes that would be necessary to address the weaknesses the crisis had revealed. Alongside him appeared the directors of intelligence services from major NATO members, all of whom had received comprehensive briefings on how sophisticated coordination had defeated their most advanced surveillance systems. The coordination protocols identified by Deputy Director Chen represent a new category of threat that our current analytical frameworks are inadequately equipped to address, Stoltenberg announced to the assembled officials. This assessment has revealed institutional biases that create exploitable vulnerabilities in our collective defense capabilities. Margaret was invited to present her comprehensive analysis to the senior leadership, walking them through months of diplomatic preparation that had established coordination frameworks invisible to traditional electronic surveillance. Her presentation, demonstred how routine diplomatic communications had created legal and operational foundations for military coordination, exceeded anything NATO intelligence had considered possible. The operation succeeded because it exploited our institutional preference for technological solutions over human analysis, Margaret explained, highlighting specific examples of how diplomatic coordination had operated through channels that electronic systems classified as routine administrative traffic. Sophisticated adversaries understand our analytical biases and design operations that appear legitimate to automated monitoring while creating strategic capabilities that threaten alliance security. The intelligence directors asked detailed questions about how similar coordination might be detected in the future, recognizing that traditional electronic surveillance would prove inadequate against threats that operated through legitimate diplomatic and commercial channels. Margaret's responses emphasized that effective threat detection required integration of technological capabilities with human expertise that could understand the political dynamics driving sophisticated operations. Director Sarah Williams of the CIA contributed additional context about how the assessment had been designed to evaluate NATO's institutional capabilities under realistic threat conditions. Deputy Director Chen's placement was coordinated with Alliance leadership to simulate conditions where experienced analysts might be marginalized by command structures that prioritize technological assessments over human intelligence. The discussion revealed broader patterns of institutional bias that extended beyond the immediate crisis to encompass fundamental assumptions about how modern intelligence communities should balance technological sophistication with human expertise. Several intelligence directors acknowledged similar challenges within their own organizations, where experienced analysts often found their insights dismissed in favor of algorithmic assessments that couldn't process qualitative intelligence. General Morrison presented recommendations for institutional reforms that would address the vulnerabilities the assessment had identified. We need to develop analytical frameworks that integrate technological capabilities with human expertise in ways that prevent sophisticated coordination from operating below our detection thresholds. Margaret was asked to lead a comprehensive review of NATO intelligence procedures, with authority to recommend structural changes that would enhance the alliance's ability to detect political military coordination operating through legitimate diplomatic and commercial channels. Her new assignment represented recognition that modern security challenges required analytical approaches that transcended traditional boundaries between technological and human intelligence. The immediate crisis was resolved through diplomatic pressure that exploited the same legal frameworks the coordination had relied upon for political cover. Margaret's analysis had identified specific vulnerabilities in the coordination agreements that allowed NATO to disrupt the operation without escalating to military confrontation. Captain Walsh was assigned to work directly with Margaret on developing enhanced analytical protocols that would integrate electronic surveillance with human intelligence in ways that could detect sophisticated coordination operating through multiple channels simultaneously. Her technological expertise, combined with Margaret's understanding of political dynamics, created analytical capabilities that exceeded what either approach could achieve independently. Lieutenant Colonel Kim received authorization to establish a new analytical division focused specifically on hybrid threats that operated through legitimate political and commercial processes. Her assignment represented institutional recognition that modern security challenges required dedicated capabilities for detecting coordination that traditional intelligence frameworks were designed to ignore. The organizational changes extended throughout NATO intelligence structures, with experienced analysts being reassigned to senior positions where their expertise could influence strategic assessments rather than being marginalized in peripheral support roles. Margaret's case had demonstrated that institutional biases could create critical vulnerabilities that sophisticated adversaries would inevitably exploit. Training programs were established to educate younger intelligence officers about the limitations of purely technological approaches to threat assessment, emphasizing the continuing importance of human analysis and understanding the political coordination that enabled sophisticated military operations. Margaret was appointed to oversee these educational initiatives, ensuring that future intelligence professionals would understand both the capabilities and limitations of the tools at their disposal. The broader intelligence community began implementing similar reforms, recognizing that the NATO assessment had revealed vulnerabilities that extended far beyond alliance structures to encompass fundamental assumptions about modern intelligence work. Margaret's analysis became a case study in how institutional biases could blind sophisticated organizations to threats that operated through channels they had been trained to ignore. Margaret Chen had been recalled to service to assess NATO's intelligence capabilities under realistic threat conditions, but the assessment had revealed institutional vulnerabilities that required comprehensive reforms extending far beyond her original mission scope. The quiet competence that had been systematically dismissed had proven essential for understanding threats that sophisticated adversaries were already exploiting. forcing recognition that technological superiority alone could never provide adequate security against enemies who understood how to exploit human weaknesses in organizational structures. 6 months after the crisis that had exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in NATO intelligence capabilities, Margaret stood before a classroom of senior military officers from across the alliance, teaching the lessons that had emerged from institutional failure and institutional learning. The Advanced Strategic Intelligence Institute represented a new approach to preparing military leaders for threats that operated through political coordination rather than conventional military channels. The students included colonels in general, officers who would shape intelligence policy for the next generation, many of whom had built their careers on mastery of technological systems that had proven inadequate against sophisticated hybrid warfare. Margaret's curriculum forced them to confront the limitations of purely technological approaches while developing analytical skills that could integrate human intelligence with electronic surveillance. Modern threats exploit our institutional biases by operating through channels we've been trained to ignore, Margaret explained to the assembled officers, using the Eastern European crisis as a case study in how sophisticated adversaries understood NATO analytical frameworks better than NATO understood itself. Effective threat detection requires recognizing that our technological superiority can become a strategic vulnerability when enemies design operations specifically to exploit our reliance on electronic intelligence. Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Park raised her hand to ask about practical applications of these theoretical insights. Ma'am, how do we develop institutional capabilities that can detect coordination operating through legitimate diplomatic and commercial channels without drowning in false positives from routine international cooperation? Margaret recognized that Park's question addressed one of the fundamental challenges in implementing the institutional reforms that had emerged from the crisis assessment. The key is understanding that sophisticated coordination reveals itself through patterns that become visible when human analysis provides interpretive frameworks for electronic intelligence. Technology can detect the mechanisms of coordination, but human expertise is necessary to understand the strategic purposes that give those mechanisms meaning. The classroom discussion revealed ongoing tensions within the intelligence community between officers who trusted technological solutions and those who had learned to appreciate the continuing importance of human analysis. Margaret facilitated these discussions with the understanding that institutional change required convincing technological enthusiasts rather than simply overruling them. Captain Torres, a cyber warfare specialist, contributed insights about how the technical aspects of the Eastern European operation had been designed to exploit specific limitations in NATO monitoring systems. The coordination protocols were established through legitimate network security upgrades that our systems classified as routine administrative improvements. We detected all the individual components, but couldn't recognize the integrated threat, because our analytical frameworks assumed hostile coordination would operate through channels we were specifically monitoring. Margaret used Torres's observations to demonstrate how effective threat assessment required understanding the operational logic that enabled sophisticated coordination rather than simply cataloging the technical mechanisms through which it operated. Electronic surveillance provides comprehensive data about what is happening, but human analysis is necessary to understand why coordination is developing and what strategic objectives it serves. The Institute's curriculum included practical exercises where students attempted to detect coordination operating through simulated diplomatic and commercial traffic, learning to recognize the subtle indicators that sophisticated operations use to establish legal and operational frameworks, while remaining invisible to algorithmic analysis. These exercises revealed how difficult it was to maintain analytical objectivity when institutional incentives rewarded confidence in technological solutions. Major Rodriguez, who had originally collaborated with Margaret during the crisis, now taught courses on integrating cyber intelligence with human analysis, demonstrating how technological and qualitative insights could be combined to detect threats that neither approach could identify independently. His classes emphasized that effective modern intelligence required analytical flexibility rather than rigid adherence to either technological or human-centered approaches. The institutional changes extended beyond NATO to influence intelligence training throughout the alliance, with Margaret serving as consultant to national intelligence services that were implementing similar reforms. Her analysis of the Eastern European crisis had become required reading for senior intelligence officers, forcing recognition that technological superiority alone could never provide adequate security against enemies who understood how to exploit organizational weaknesses. Student evaluations revealed ongoing resistance to acknowledging the limitations of technological approaches, but also growing recognition that sophisticated threats required analytical capabilities that transcended traditional boundaries between different intelligence disciplines. Margaret's teaching emphasized that institutional humility was a strategic asset rather than an analytical weakness. The Institute established exchange programs with academic institutions that specialized in political analysis and cultural studies, recognizing that effective intelligence work required expertise that extended beyond traditional military and technological training. Margaret coordinated these programs, ensuring that intelligence professionals developed appreciation for insights that couldn't be quantified, but remained essential for understanding human coordination. Advanced students were assigned to conduct assessments of their own organizations, looking for institutional biases that might create vulnerabilities, similar to those the Eastern European crisis had exploited. These assessments revealed widespread patterns of technological overconfidence that sophisticated adversaries were already attempting to exploit through operations designed specifically to defeat electronic surveillance. Margaret's teaching emphasized that the Eastern European crisis represented a category of threat that would become increasingly common as adversaries learned to exploit the gap between technological capabilities and human understanding. Future intelligence professionals would need analytical skills that could detect political coordination, operating through legitimate processes while avoiding the institutional biases that had nearly precipitated a major international conflict. Quiet competence that had been systematically dismissed was now being recognized as essential for understanding threats that operated through human coordination rather than electronic communication. Margaret Chen had become responsible for ensuring that future intelligence professionals would understand both the capabilities and limitations of their technological tools, developing the analytical humility necessary to recognize expertise wherever it appeared within their organizations. 3 years after the crisis that had fundamentally altered NATO's approach to intelligence analysis, Margaret received an encrypted communication that would test everything the alliance had learned about detecting sophisticated threats operating through legitimate channels. The message arrived through priority CIA channels while she was conducting advanced threat assessment training at the Strategic Intelligence Institute, carrying authentication codes that indicated immediate escalation to the highest levels of Alliance Command. The intelligence briefing revealed coordination patterns emerging across multiple theaters simultaneously, suggesting that adversaries had learned from the Eastern European operation and were implementing even more sophisticated approaches to hybrid warfare. Diplomatic communications in Southeast Asia, commercial agreements in Africa, and technical cooperation protocols in Latin America were showing linguistic patterns that Margaret's analytical frameworks had been trained to recognize. General Morrison, now serving as Director of NATO Strategic Intelligence, convened an emergency session that included intelligence directors from across the alliance, along with the new generation of analysts who had been trained in integrated human technological approaches to threat assessment. The secure conference facility buzzed with the controlled urgency of professionals who understood they were confronting threats that exceeded their previous experience. Deputy Director Chen, your analytical frameworks are detecting coordination patterns across 3 separate continents, Morrison announced, displaying global intelligence feeds that showed subtle indicators of systematic preparation occurring through channels that traditional surveillance systems would classify as routine international cooperation. We need immediate assessment of whether we're facing coordinated global operations or coincidental regional developments. Margaret approached the analysis with the systematic methodology that had emerged from years of institutional learning following the European crisis. Her team now included Captain Walsh, who had become expert at integrating electronic intelligence with human analysis, and Lieutenant Colonel Kim, whose technological expertise had been enhanced by understanding of political coordination that enabled sophisticated operations. The linguistic patterns were unmistakable once properly analyzed, revealing coordination that exceeded anything the intelligence community had previously encountered. Diplomatic communications were establishing legal frameworks across multiple continents simultaneously, while commercial agreements created economic coordination capabilities that could support strategic objectives extending far beyond their apparent scope. This represents the evolution of the coordination model we identified during the European crisis, Margaret announced to the assembled intelligence leadership. The current operation is establishing global frameworks through legitimate diplomatic and commercial processes that create strategic capabilities across multiple theaters simultaneously. Captain Walsh contributed electronic intelligence that supported Margaret's assessment, revealing technical coordination occurring through channels that appeared to be routine international cooperation, but actually established sophisticated communication and logistics capabilities. The cyber components are being established through legitimate technology transfer agreements that create redundant coordination capabilities across continental boundaries. Lieutenant Colonel Kim integrated satellite imagery with diplomatic analysis, demonstrating how routine infrastructure development projects were creating strategic capabilities that could support coordinated operations across vast geographical distances. The coordination is establishing both digital and physical infrastructure that could support operations, exceeding anything we've previously considered possible. Margaret's analysis revealed that adversaries had learned from the European operation and were implementing coordination on a scale that challenged fundamental assumptions about how international security functioned. Rather than operating within regional boundaries, the current coordination was establishing global capabilities that could create strategic pressure across multiple theaters simultaneously. The objective appears to be creating global coordination capabilities that could challenge the international system itself. Margaret explained while highlighting communications that revealed the comprehensive scope of the operation. This isn't regional destabilization. This is systematic preparation for restructuring international relationships according to alternative frameworks that bypass existing alliance structures. The intelligence assessment continued throughout the day as Margaret's team correlated developments across multiple continents, revealing coordination that operated through legitimate international processes while creating strategic vulnerabilities that traditional security frameworks weren't designed to address. The scope exceeded anything the intelligence community had imagined possible. Director Williams of the CIA participated via secure link from Langley, her expression reflecting recognition that the coordination Margaret was analyzing represented threats to fundamental assumptions about international stability. Deputy Director Chen, what are the strategic implications of coordination operating at this scale? Margaret understood that Williams's question addressed challenges that extended beyond traditional military threats to encompass the political foundations of international order itself. The coordination is designed to create alternative frameworks for international cooperation that could bypass existing alliance structures and international institutions. Success would fundamentally alter how global security functions. The response required coordination between intelligence services that had learned to integrate human analysis with technological capabilities, but the scale of the threat exceeded anything their reformed analytical frameworks had been designed to address. Margaret found herself coordinating global intelligence operations that represented the practical implementation of everything the Alliance had learned about sophisticated threats. Young intelligence officers who had been trained in Margaret's integrated analytical approaches were deployed to monitor coordination across multiple continents, applying lessons learned from the European crisis to detect preparation occurring through legitimate diplomatic and commercial channels. Their work represented practical validation of institutional reforms that had emerged from previous intelligence failures. The global coordination was detected and disrupted through diplomatic pressure that exploited the same legal frameworks the operation had relied upon for political cover. But the scale of preparation revealed that sophisticated adversaries were continuously evolving their approaches to exploit institutional vulnerabilities that remained within international security systems. Margaret Chen had become responsible for detecting and countering threats that operated through human coordination rather than electronic communication. But each successful operation revealed new approaches that challenged existing analytical frameworks. The quiet competence that had once been dismissed was now essential for understanding enemies who designed operations specifically to exploit institutional biases within intelligence communities that had learned to balance technological capabilities with human expertise. The secure phone rang one final time as Margaret prepared to leave her office at the Strategic Intelligence Institute. On the line was a young CIA analyst stationed in Beijing, her voice carrying the same mixture of uncertainty and professional determination that Margaret remembered from her own early career. "Ma'am, I'm seeing linguistic patterns in trade negotiations that don't match normal commercial language. My supervisors think I'm overthinking routine business correspondence, but something feels wrong about the coordination protocols being established." Margaret smiled, recognizing in the analyst's careful observations the same analytical instincts that had driven her own career. "Send me your analysis. And remember, trust what you're seeing, even when others can't see it yet." After ending the call, Margaret reflected on how far the intelligence community had come since that morning when she'd stepped off the transport at Ramstein. The institutional changes were real, but the work of recognizing expertise wherever it appeared remained an ongoing challenge that each new generation would have to learn for themselves. The next crisis would come from directions they hadn't anticipated, coordinated through channels they hadn't thought to monitor, by adversaries who understood their blind spots better than they understood themselves. But now there were people trained to listen for the quiet voices, to recognize the patterns others missed, to understand that the most dangerous threats often whispered rather than shouted. Margaret Chen had taught an entire generation that true strength comes from knowing what you don't know, and having the wisdom to listen when someone else sees what you've missed. What did you think of Margaret's incredible journey from dismissed liability to the woman who saved the world? Have you ever been underestimated because of your age, appearance, or background? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire our next video. If you enjoyed this story of quiet competence defeating loud arrogance, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're building a community that celebrates the unsung heroes who see what others miss. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. We love connecting with our amazing global audience, who appreciate stories about real expertise being recognized when it matters most.